Well, good evening, brothers. Thank you for joining Alexandria-Washington Lodge number 22 Esoteric Corner. I'm Brother Rob Swanson, the Lodge Education Officer of AW22 and your host for Esoteric Corner. This is one part of our attempts to further Masonic education. So not only the brothers within our lodge, but thanks to Google Meet, we can extend that education to our brothers everywhere. It has been our goal to explore the esoteric or other Masonic topics and generate some interesting discussions. We will start with a presentation, followed by a Q&A and discussion. Just a few ground rules. As this is an untiled meeting, we cannot divulge any Masonic secrets, so please remember your obligations. Also, please be respectful of others' views and remain on the level. Publics can touch on a broader religious or political theme, but we will not advocate a particular religion or political view. Please remain respectful. Brother Chris Ruli is on the executive board of the Scottish Rite Research Society. He's the third vice president of the Philalethes Society and historian archivist for the Valley of Washington, D.C. Brother Chris is also an AW22 archives member, sitting high priest of Washington Potomac chapter number 8, Royal Arch Masons, and Potomac Commandery number 3, Knights Templar in D.C. This topic is going to be on what can the Cult of Mithras tell us about Freemasonry and other initiatic orders. The Cult of Mithras, an ancient mystery religion practiced in the Roman Empire, has perplexed historians since its discovery. In this presentation, Brother Chris Ruli examines the institution's past, unique characteristics, and attempts to draw parallels to contemporary initiatic orders and societies like Freemasonry. Brother Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, thank you, Brother Robert. Thanks for inviting me, and I look forward to a good presentation and discussion. I'm happy to proceed if you'd like me to, or if
Absolutely.
Excellent. Okay, so good evening, brethren, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So the Cult of Mithras is one of these sort of things that I've always been interested and curious in. And when we had this discussion earlier on, Brother Rob reached out to me and said, "Hey, is there anything you'd like to talk about?" It's sort of tough asking me because I'm always on the history side. I tend to focus more on sort of Masonic history, research history. So when I told them, well, I've got this, but sort of work that I've been doing, my passion, I guess you could say, is when I'm not doing Masonic research or Masonic history, I have a weird fascination with the Cult of Mithras. And so I've been reading up a lot about it, and I'll tell you a little bit more, a personal story, just in a minute. And so this, as Brother Rob mentioned, this is going to be really a general discussion. I'm happy, and if there's a brother there who is an expert on Mithras, I'm happy to dive in at a different time and really go through archaeological studies and examinations. But for now, I think the benefit is let's get people speaking and communicating appropriately about this unique thing, this body that existed for some time and then effectively disappeared. There's a really good scholar around the turn of the 20th century who basically wrote that if it wasn't for the domination of the Christian religion, we all could have possibly all been Mithraic initiates by now if Christianity never really evolved and became the thing that it was today. So that was a sort of a statement that struck me, and that's something that I'm curious about. Now, there will be, I think, as you go through the presentation, you'll hear things about the initiatic orders. You'll hear a little bit about its organization's origin, where it comes from, the characteristics, the geography, and then later on, towards the end of the presentation, we'll go into the parallels associated to initiatic orders and Freemasonry. So please hold off on those questions, and perhaps as we go through the presentation, I'll answer some of those. Now, I wouldn't be a good researcher without pointing you to topics or books that you should consider. And so here are some pretty good or pretty decent works that I've used personally. I've purchased at least the first three, and then the last two are electronic sources. But the first is Frans Coumans, who's a Belgian researcher, archaeologist, Texts and Illustrated Monuments Relating to the Mysteries of Mithra. That's a 1904 English translation. He was a Belgian. He wrote in French. The French edition is out, and I believe 1904, so you can probably find it on Happy Trust or some other resource. You can find that original translation. It's very good. You don't have to pay for it, but I purchased it because I wanted a paper copy. Manfred Klaus, who also wrote a really good book on the Roman cult of Mithras, and then he had a little bit of a Christian bend. So just, take note of that. Roger Beck's Mithras and the Greek and Roman World. Roger really is a Hellenistic author or scholar. So he really was focusing on the Greek and Roman influence, more Greek than that on Mithras. So that was an interesting one as well. Tertullian, Roger Pierce is this writer, author, scholar who basically manages his own Wikipedia on Mithras. And so if you went online and found his work, it's a really good, I only have 5 minutes. What can I learn? That's a really good place to learn a lot about the cult. And then there is a, not necessarily defunct, but they haven't really published a lot, but there was an electronic journal of Mithraic studies, and that was a really good resource to see papers and documents and things on that. So sort of new and stuff that's been working on. There is an international conference of Mithraic scholars, and I've had an opportunity to examine some of those on JSTOR. I strongly recommend, if you have access to your university, or if you somehow have access to JSTOR through work or professional, please consider looking at those articles. You'll find some really interesting ones. But these are the ones that I would say, let's start with these books and go from there. Now, I start this presentation because you would think that we'd dive into the ancient mysteries, but I start this presentation with a guy named Martin Luther King Jr. MLK, I didn't really, my initiatic or my interest in Mithras really began or started through MLK. Weird introduction, I know, but back in 1949, it was his second year of his, I think it was his second or first year, his second class was on Christian religion. And one of his papers back in Crozer Theological Seminary in, I believe it was Pennsylvania, he wrote a study on Mithraism and the cult of Mithras and this idea. And so his paper, when I was taking a comparative religions class back in college, I randomly found his paper. I had to write my own paper. And so my college paper was clarifying and updating his work on Mithras and this idea of what he sort of thought about the religion or how it involved Christianity. Now, I will say there are things that have evolved over time since his paper. He got an A on the paper. The professor really liked how clean and how well he wrote in his prose. And looking back at his paper, it was very well, organized. But as we go through the presentation, you'll see that he utilizes a lot of the same research. Some of that research is now outdated. And so we'll go through those topics. And so I always found that sort of striking that it's MLK who introduced me to the cult of Mithras, not, Mackey or all these interesting individuals. Now, I start this by saying, I think whenever you do history, whenever we talk about history, whenever we talk about ancient studies or comparative religions, I always appreciate the context, or I think the context really matters. And so, in other words, how does one start, or how does one begin the conversation of thinking about an ancient study or an ancient religion? And so I've used this before, and in fact, I use it on my paper. Imagine an organization that no longer exists. And so this is a Masonic context. So let's say Masonry, the anti-Masons in the 1840s win, and there's no more Masonry. And let's say what's left of the organization is basically our Masonic lodges. Pretend there was nothing written on it because everything back then was word of mouth. And imagine that really imagine someone who's never been a part of this organization visits or stumbles upon an abandoned Masonic lodge. What would they see? What are the characteristics? What are the things that they may find? Well, they may find, let's say it's a somewhat organized and somewhat well-organized lodge room. they might find chairs and furniture and things on the wall, paintings, inscriptions, things that are related to us, that are important to us, obviously, as initiates and members of the organization. But to them, they may not necessarily know what that means. So, for example, here's a great postcard of AW22's old lodge room back in their city hall. Imagine it was abandoned. The organization died out. It's 100 or maybe perhaps 300 years later, and they see a portrait of George Washington on the wall. That famous portrait of his, grumpy Washington with his sash. And perhaps you go to different lodges and you have a picture of George Washington on the wall. Well, a researcher 300 years later will go, perhaps George Washington was really important to this organization. Perhaps he was a deity, perhaps he was a reverend, perhaps he was revered in some capacity. And perhaps, those 3 steps up to this chair on the east side of this building versus the west side of this building, perhaps these things are important. That's the context for how, for the last 200 to 300 years, scholars have been looking at this cult. There are no written works of this organization or this institution. In other words, no Mithraic high priest wrote stuff down and said, here is the organization's work. There is no written text, foundational text for this organization. In fact, some of the writings and some of the commentaries come from people that were either in that organ or around the time the organization was decaying or declining. And in certain instances, a lot of these scholars are looking at an organization from 200 or 300 years later, and they're trying to make their best guess in terms of what this organization operated. Remember, their organization's writings, they basically come from the things that were left in that lodge space or in that lodge hall. Now, I'm conflating these two, but we'll talk a little more about it in a bit. But think of it in that context. Imagine you just arrived in some building, you see a tessellated floorboard, you see a picture of perhaps George Washington. Once in a while, you may see a G on the east. What does that mean? That's the context that these scholars have been into, and some of them are not even scholars; they're just historians. Or in Mithras's, or in our context, these were Christian writers, Christian theologians, and they tried their best to make sense of what these things are, based on what they have their own, personal biases. Around the turn of the 20th century, and I mentioned this guy first, Franz Kuhlmann. He's the guy on the left-hand side with this really great mustache and outfit, and his colleague are on the right-hand side here. He's visiting one of these Mithrae. These are these physical buildings, not like a lodge hall, but a physical space. And so here's a great picture of him. And so he was very interested in this organization, this institution, this body. And so he, by the way, for the last 200, 150 plus years, people have been writing, have been talking about, or actually more than not just 200 years, 300, 400, 500 years. They've been talking about this organization. But Kuhlmann really, does probably the best preliminary foundational work. He goes out and tries to identify which ones are Hellenistic temples, which one are Mithraic temples, which one are Christian temples, and tries to catalog all of them. He really is the first person to assert that there's this dogma or discipline around Mithras, or the organization or the cult. And one of the other things he does is he, as you see in this picture at the top right, he starts to figure out, well, okay, we know that if you see the following 5 or 6 things that we'll talk about later in this presentation, if you see 5 or 6 of these things in this building, then we know that this is a Mithras building. Sort of like saying, well, if you go into a Masonic lodge and we see a tessellated floor, we see these chairs situated in this room, we see an altar somewhere placed in the middle, perhaps near the altar, near the east or in the middle, dead center, we see the lights, we know that that's a Masonic lodge. So he goes through this checklist of okay, here are 10 or 12 characteristics. This is a Mithrae. This is one of these lodges. So let's mark it down. And so he marks it down. What does he notice? Now, at the bottom left of your screen, you'll see this is actually a Google map that I just actually pulled today of ancient Roman temples, not related to Mithrae. This is, this is Jupiter, this is Saturn, this is Cronus, this is, this is the traditional Hellenistic Greco-Roman buildings. At the top right is Mithrae. And you'll notice, of course, around Rome, you'll see some, but really it's the outer regions of the empire. Top north in France and, what sort of northern Gaul by the Germanic states, you'll see a lot of them. You'll also see them in the, top northeast, like Romania, perhaps one or two in Greece. You head over and you might find a couple in, on the eastern, in the Middle East. So these are not located in the same places that you would find the classical Hellenistic Greco-Roman place. So he makes a opposite or a proposal or a theory that, well, these are the borderlands. These are where the Roman Empire occupied and had soldiers. So he makes the claim, and it's effectively one of the things that is still consistently not debunked. This is pretty much a standard, that the Mithrae, or this cult, effectively operated around military, foreign diplomat, perhaps, servant slave sort of culture. This was not the high imperial, senatorial. This was the working man, blue collar, soldier, carpenter, the guys that were going out to find resources, businessmen kind of thing. This was not the upper crust. This was, upper middle class to lower class kind of organization. What does he also find during this process? He finds that the structure, the building, the Mithrae, these places that people met and congregated, well, they often were underground, caves, not a lot, no light, not a lot of light, no light. They often were in a rectangular format. People sat on benches on the right-hand side or left-hand side. There often was some sort of, you may not necessarily call it an altar, but a place either in the middle or perhaps on one side of the building where a bust, a figure, a statue, something was associated to the Mithrae cult. Oftentimes, the Mithrae were always very close to water because, as part of the ritual, they believed, as part of the ritual, water somehow was included in the ritual. And in certain Mithrae, you'll also see images of the Roman god Oceanus. Not necessarily in all of them, but in some of them, you'll see Oceanus as part of the iconography. What are the things, again, part of that checklist that Kuman's going through? There is often a visage, an icon of this gentleman, this person, this young being called Mithras. And this is where Kuman makes this idea of, this is the name of the organization. This is the person. It's centered around one man. He's often youthful. He's often wearing a Phoenician cap. That Phoenician cap is later appropriated in the French Revolution and different revolutions, often associated with liberty, the Phrygian cap. He is often, and in fact, not often, always, end of statement, always depicted with his left knee on a bull. His left arm is holding the bull up in a position where the bull's head or neck is exposed. In his right hand, he is carrying a sword, a dagger, some sharp instrument, and he is either in the process of stabbing the bull or is trying to lance or lacerate the bull. Around this icon, there are often images of a snake, dogs, the sun, either represented by a person on like a sort of visage of a person, or perhaps multiple people either holding the sun, carrying the sun, Sometimes those individuals are holding a scepter, sometimes they're holding a torch. Again, these are just iterations, but almost in every single instance, unless the bust or the statue was destroyed or vandalized, it's often there. Now, who is Mithra? Now, Kuman and all these sort of older researchers make the case that, well, aha, Mithra, we know the name. We know the name. It comes from an Iranian and Zoroastrian cult or their religion from 2,000 years ago. Now, remember, the Mithras cult is really unique because in future studies, we'll find that researchers really see that the cult begins in 100 CE. So this is 100 years after the birth of Christ. It begins that time. But Mithra is 2,000 years in the past. So there is this idea, and in fact, in the first International Congress of Mithraic Studies in 1971, where the first sets of papers, there were effectively 2 papers that basically debunked this idea that Kuman and other people have confirmed or thought they for 200, 300 years, that Mithra was somehow tied to this Iranian Zoroastrian person. In fact, what they showed cases of is it could not have possibly been. They likely took the name of the Iranian and Zoroastrian god because effectively Mithra in that religion or in that system of belief was associated with the sun, associated with Sol Invictus, was associated with this idea of light. And so they took that name and they basically incorporated it into this cult. But there really, really is no, according to these scholars that presented in 1971 in the first Congress, there's very little connection to the Iranian Mithra and Mithras as his cult, effectively in name only. Now, here's another one of those checklists that Kuman's going through. There's oftentimes this association with a meal, a banquet, some sort of communal eating together with others. And so in this picture, you'll see here, Mithra is actually not the one at the top where he has this sort of sun bright light behind him that looks sort of pseudo-Christian if you're really thinking about it, or perhaps Hellenistic like Apollo or Helios. He's actually on the right-hand side. He's got his cap on and he's receiving something. And so again, there's this idea of food, and archaeologists have seen in Mithrae evidence of food scattered around these temples and buildings. So clearly there's broken plates and pottery, and there's an association with meal. And so in many cases what they're saying, and again, the back of your mind, you might be possibly thinking, well, there's this is the religion, this is where people come together, this is where people eat and commune. That's obviously, food is a part of the religious and the communal process, so that sort of makes sense. There's also this is also sometimes where the Christian element comes in. There's this idea of a virginal birth. Now, Kuman calls it a virginal birth. It's not the virginal birth as in Mithra was born, out of a virgin, but there was no woman involved. Now, in the Mithraic idea, a lot of the scholars believe that the story is that he was born out of a stone. And in many depictions in Mithrae, you'll see what you see here. He's either just coming out of a stone or he's moving out of the stone. And then around him, for some curious reason, around him, there's always the depiction of the zodiac. So he's born, and then around him is this zodiac, the actual zodiacal figures are around. So there's another curious little connection. And so certain Christian scholars say, aha, well, he's a virgin birth. Perhaps this is the origins of Christianity, or the Romans were using the Christian doctrine and incorporating that into the Mithraic doctrine. But again, this idea of a virgin birth has effectively been roundly rejected in modern scholars. There's been papers written about this. There's another curious figure. Now, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right because I've only seen it written as I'm writing it, but Arimanes is this Zoroastrian deity, And Mithraic scholars have basically rejected the idea that this Arimanes, this demon godlike entity who effectively has the face of a lion, 2 to 4 sets of wings, he's wrapped around a serpent, and he's holding certain items like a scepter or a torch. There's effectively been debunked that well, not effectively been debunked, but there are it's almost not probable that there's a connection between the Zoroastrian. They believe that this is a separate entity. Why do they believe that? Because oftentimes this Arimanes is sort of seen as an ancillary figure. He doesn't appear in every single Mithraic in Mithrai, but he appears in so many that they believe that they know there's a connection here, but they don't really necessarily believe it's association with the Zoroastric. Again, feel free to take a look at the books by Marcel Close, and Kuman brings him in and believes again, oh, the this is a part of this Zoroastrian Iranian culture. It came over, and then the Romans took it over. Not necessarily true. Okay, now let's so those were the checklists, right? Now here's another part of the checklist, the actual initiatic grades. So we start at the bottom left of this screen with Corax, or the Raven. There are 7 initiatic grades or degrees or orders. The first one is the Raven. The next one is the Lamp, or the Nymphus. The third is the Soldier. The fourth is Leo, the Lion. And again, with every single degree, there are symbols associated. There are specific symbols associated. And as you go further, the belief, like any other initiatic order, is that you learn a little bit more based on this process. The 5th is Persis. The 2nd is Sun Runner, or Hilidronus. And then the last one is Pater, or Father. Now, we see researchers have found that the most sort of common, or the most, recurring of these grades or symbols that we see is Pater. It's that last one. It's that last class. They also believe, now, unfortunately, this goes back to Kuman and those previous, people's works, that there seems to be something associated with the Lion, or the Leo degree. And so when you get to Leo degree, you become officially what they called a participant. That meant that the guys who were actively involved in the lodge, perhaps you can, I don't necessarily want to say officer, but perhaps you want to call them an officer. The guys who were really involved had to hit at least be a Leo. And then as you go further, Persis, Sunrunner, Pater, they start to become more important. But again, we don't really know what those signify, what their connections were. Some Christian scholars, I just had him. We're actually going to reference him a little later. A couple Christian scholars claim that they created these magnificent, examples of what these mean and the symbology around it, but unfortunately, we don't really know what the symbology is. And any claim that says they know what the symbology is not accurate, or it's certainly not academically viable. But what we do know is we see these symbols around, and we see them in a hierarchy. They when you walk into a Mithrai, for example, you see them in a certain order, and you see them in the same order. So that's where scholars believed these are the different grades. And then you see them written at, individuals gave them titles for these grades. Now, this is really interesting. We found in an Egyptian papyri, and I believe this was last published in 2003, it's either 2003 or 1993, one of those two. We see in an Egyptian text, right, an Egyptian papyri, we see part of the ritual back and forth, the catechism, as you'd say, right? And so here's an excerpt of that catechism. Some of these words these are words that were pulled out, and they thought, okay, here's some interesting stuff that we might find, or some relevant stuff. So let's say, for example, a very sharp, he will say, again, this is only parts of it. It's not a full sentence, but there are some that are interesting. So he will say, has it been wrapped? and they'll say the saviors. He will say, who is the Father? The one who begets everything. So there's a pseudo-religious associated to it. How did you become a Leo? By the blank of the Father. Drink food. There's these interesting little nuggets that people can say, aha, here's something associated with Mithrae. And again, because none of this stuff was ever written down, it's so unique to have it on a papyri. It's so unique to have it and found in Egypt no less, not in one of the places where Mithrae exist, but somewhere outside of potential Mithrae. Now, perhaps there was one in Egypt or where this papyri was found, but certainly far away from the location. One of the things that often is connected, right? So if you're interested in religions or comparative religions, certainly Christianity, there's obviously this apparent perception of a connection to Christianity. And remember, this was about 100 years after Christianity was effectively became, popular. So Christianity was very dominant or growing in dominance in the Roman Empire by the time that the Mithras cult is known to have existed or started or really taken root. And so later on, a couple hundred years later, Christian scholars are looking back and trying to make sense of these things. But unfortunately, many times they try to find ways of making these connections, and at times they seem to be either lying or not providing any evidence for their work. And so these rumors, these stories, these ideas start to form or morph and evolve. And you get examples like Geoffrey Higgins in his 1836 work that apparently Mithras had 12 disciples. No reference to, the disciples in Mithrae, no pictures, no frescoes of 12 disciples. He's never associated with 12 disciples. And so one of the scholars now who debunked this says, well, perhaps that was the zodiac signs that he's making a reference to, because you can see Cancer and all these other different zodiac signs. So, but to this, Geoffrey Higgins, aha, here, look, he has disciples all of a sudden. Thomas W. Doane in his Bible Myths and Parallels to Other Religions, this is 1882, makes a claim that after his birth from a rock, Mithras was visited by magi. No reference to it. No reference in any work. Nothing in pictures, nothing in frescoes, nothing in sculpture, nothing, except for his attempt in 1822. Aurelian, who's the emperor in 214 through 2075, effectively declares that the holiday for Sol Invictus, or the holiday for the sun, would be December 25th. And so in many later writings by Christian scholars, Christian theologians, they make this claim, aha, look, Mithras was obviously born on December 25th, just like Christ, because that's when, the religion said it would not, have a feast day for Mithras. Well, in fact, that was just Aurelian, an emperor's decision to make the feast day December 25th. But again, scholars take that and say, well, this is clearly evidence that this is some sort of Judeo-religion Christian association. But there is no reference to Mithras or the celebration on the 25th in frescoes and paintings and anything that is actually in the building. There's no reference to it at all. But Christian scholars will try to make those connections. Now, what we do find is there's one Mithrae in Syria where Christians had vandalized an old Mithrae temple, or not temple, but a Mithrae, and they wrote graffiti on the walls, pro-Christian graffiti. There is one Roman scholar who witnessed, or in his writings witnesses, a group of Christians going into a Mithrae, destroying the Mithrae, taking out the idols, and parading them through the streets. Look at what these idols, what these Romans are, believing in. And so there clearly is evidence of Christian vandalism against these sites. And why is that the case? Well, unfortunately for the Mithrae cult, Christianity by that time, in the next couple hundred years, becomes the dominant religion. It becomes the dominant religion of the empire. It is Constantine and everyone else in the empire considered as official religion. And what happens when you have an official religion become Christianity? Very few or fewer patrons of that religion will support Mithrae. And so most people are saying, listen, why am I going to put my money, resources, and time on creating more Mithrae when the official religion is Christianity? So the organization starts to lose people. It starts to lose patrons. And at the time when, over about 200 years of worship, it just happens, coincidentally perhaps, that there's a backlash against worshiping the perception of a Persian god, because the Romans were actually in a war with Persia. And so there's certainly, I call it the freedom fries issue, where it's like, we're not supporting these guys anymore. We're not supporting them. Anything associated to Persian god, let's get it out of here. Well, we don't even like the name, Mithra anymore. So there's this backlash against Persian things, Persian iconography, even though really scholars see that there was no connection outside of the name Mithras and perhaps one or two idols, no connection to the cult itself. And then the other thing is, well, look where all these buildings, look where all these Mithrae were located. They were located in the outer regions of the empire. And so over time, as the empire was slowly starting to get smaller and smaller, and barbarians and Germanics and Gauls and all these groups were basically closing in on the Roman Empire, they were destroying old Mithrae. They were destroying any evidence of these buildings and where they were, these caves. And so clearly, the evidence of this organization basically effectively was gone, because groups were destroying them, and there was no effort by the Romans to recapture, put money to keep this thing alive. And so we are fortunate, a lot of the scholars say that we are fortunate that we know anything about this organization or about these groups or these cults, because they decided to have the Mithrae be underground in caves. And so many of these places were left untouched and unvarnished, because some of these groups didn't even know the cave existed, or these buildings existed over time. And then there's a really great example of I think it was in Romania, of a developer that was trying to build something, a new building or some economic, like a village square, and they were digging in and they found a perfectly intact Mithrae. And he basically was like, well, I don't know what to do with this. And so he basically they reburied it and just left it as is. And then until, a couple decades later, after the fall of communism, they went back in to clean it up, because they had no way of dealing with it. They didn't know what to do with it. So, again, there's just there was not a lot of information about it. They didn't know what it was. They thought it was Roman. And so you can see the back and forth, the issues associated to it. Okay. We really went through a lot. And so I want to do just a very quickly go over, what does this mean about Freemasonry now, or what is the Mithraic cult and how does it connect to Freemasonry? Now, obviously, there's no direct connection to the cult itself, to Freemasonry, but as a scholar of comparative associations and initiatic rites, I think anyone who's interested in esoteric topics will certainly find parallels to Mithrae and the Cult of Mithras. For example, Albert Mackey, in his encyclopedia, has about a page or so on the cult, and he often cites, unfortunately, Christian theologians who really are not the most accurate in their attempts to explain and understand. So unfortunately, do not take Mackey's word on Mithras when you're looking at his encyclopedia. He heavily cites this author named Charles W. King, and from his book, and he wrote a book called The Gnostics and Their Remains, and there's a chapter on Mithras in that book. And let's just say it's not really heavily sourced. It's not really heavily referenced. There's not a lot of citations. He uses there's a Christian apologist, a Christian theologian named Justin Martyr, who is anti-Mithrae. He calls them barbarians and, these demonic, he calls anything associated to Mithraes or their, ancient practices effectively demonic, anti-Christian. And so, a lot of his work, you have to take that into context when looking at his work. Now, associated Freemasonry, well, what do we see? Like Freemasonry, or like Freemasonry, Mithras, or reverse, like Mithras, Freemasonry was an organization that follows certain initiatic characteristics, let's say. Mithrae were set up throughout the empire. Lodges are set up throughout the United States. What we notice in their inscriptions and the things that we do have written down or carved on altars, on plates, on things that we can tangibly see, men of different classes were able to join. So slaves, for example, were allowed to join a Mithrae, a Mithrae. Now, were they able to go through the entire ritual? We suspect not. There is an initiation ritual. There are different degrees, right? A lot of this stuff was word of mouth, right? Very few things were written down, just like Freemasonry back then, or certainly for the first couple hundred or so years, things were word of mouth. You really didn't know what was written down until someone wrote it down. Death, this evolution of, birth and death becomes very important. The whole sacrifice or slaughter or the killing of a bull by Mithra himself seems to be extremely important to the cult. And of course, there's connections to death in Freemasonry. There is also, of course, this importance of communal eating, of food, of water. It's part of Mithras. It's, of course, something important for Freemasons, this active communal engagement. The initiatic orders are not inherently individual, they are groups, right? So Masons come together to initiate one person to go through that process together. Very similar, we believe, with Mithras, where groups of initiates come together to initiate one person. The signs and symbols provide additional meaning and additional context to the initiated. We may necessarily know everything associated, but we know that some of those symbols are important. And some of those symbols can be associated with other things that we do have information on. So the sickle, the hats, the torch, light, these are things that we can sort of figure out outside of Mithrae and outside of Freemasonry. Now, there was an idea now in the last part, and I'll open it up to questions afterwards, this last part of, is it men only? Well, there's been a lot of interesting scholarship recently in the last couple decades that actually challenged this notion from Kuman and from either theologians, Christian theologians, that it was men only. We do know from a Roman scholar that women were initiated, but again, we don't know if they were initiated in the lower levels. Did they go up to pater? Well, perhaps not. So perhaps there was this level of initiatic phases where, slaves, women, perhaps folks of a lesser class really maintained and remained in the lower, initiatic orders, while generals, diplomatic class, senators, priests, perhaps were in a higher class. Again, we don't know. We can't make that assertion quite accurately, but we believe that that's the case. Now it's 7:46. I've been speaking for 45 minutes or so, so I'm going to stop right there. This is my first time doing this presentation, so excuse me if I stumbled or rambled a bit, but I'm happy to open it to questions for the next part of our presentation. So thank you so much. I appreciate it.